Hi everyone, it's Alice, and today we are doing a nonfiction TBR for 2024. If you saw my video where I went through my reading spreadsheet, which was very interesting, at least to me, you will know that I really didn't read a lot of nonfiction last year. I think I read one, and I don't know what happened, but I just completely neglected all of my nonfiction books last year, and I didn't really get to any. And I think the one that I did get to, I actually listened to on audio, so I didn't even have it. Like, I read nothing in my backlist at all. This year, though, I want to get back into it. It's one of my reading goals for this year because I love reading nonfiction, and it's great when I get to it. I love reading about all kinds of different things. So this stack is a little bit of a mix of things, but I just want to get back into the habit of picking up nonfiction. So I have a stack of books that I'm going to show you of the most exciting nonfiction books that I have on my TBR, or at least they're very exciting to me. We're just going to dive right in, starting with The Way Through the Woods by Litt Woon, which is a book that I'm sure I'm going to love, so I'm really excited to read it. It's about this woman who loses her husband after having spent 32 years together, and in her grief, she discovers this obsession with mushroom hunting. I think books about grief are really interesting, and I'm very intrigued by this mushroom hunting aspect of this book. And I love these kinds of memoirs where we're exploring like someone's life or someone's part of a life or something that's happened to them, but we're also exploring like a completely different, seemingly unrelated thing. Like, that really works well for me in memoirs, and I'd like to read more of them, and I just think this is going to be really good. I think there are some drawings in here as well, I guess, which is very cool. A funny thing about this, though, is that I didn't realize when I picked this book up that this originally came out in Norwegian. Like, it came out in Norway in 2017, and then it was published in English in 2019. But it doesn't have a translator on it, and there's no translator in here, so I'm assuming the author translated it, maybe. But yeah, it's kind of funny to me to read a Norwegian book in English, but I have the English edition, so this is the one that I'm gonna read. But yeah, I did not realize. The second one I have is this beautiful book. This is The Garden in Every Sense and Season by Tovah. And this is a book about gardening, which, like, I'm not into gardening as a hobby myself, but for some reason I think it's an interesting thing to read about. And I think this book, like, I remember when I bought it, I read about it, and it's about, like, yes, it's about gardening, but it's about not focusing so much on the to-do list, but actually enjoying the garden that you have through all of your senses, which I think is interesting. It sounds a little bit more philosophical than anything else, and I do like reading about nature and gardens, even though I don't have a garden. And I feel like this is the kind of book where, like, what it says is going to be applicable to more than just a garden. Like, it's all about enjoying the moment, I think. Then we have another nature book, but this is more history based. It's The Invention of Nature by Andrea, Wulf, and this is a biography about Alexander von Humboldt, who was a great scientist of his age. He was really famous, and he's like the first person to have brought up this idea that nature is all interconnected and it's not just here for us humans to use as we please. He's kind of forgotten these days, so this book is all about bringing him back, I guess, and putting some focus on him. And he made a lot of discoveries, and he went on all of these different expeditions, and it just sounds very interesting. I actually am like 99% sure that I'm really gonna like this book, because I have actually read the first 50 pages of this. Like, when I got it, I started reading it, and then I think I had to read something else, so I put this down, and then I just didn't continue reading it. But I think it's gonna be great. It also has like photos in it, which I really like. The font is quite small though, so it's gonna take me a while to read, but I really like these kinds of history books and these kinds of biographies, and I'm excited to learn much more about this guy. I also periodically get comments about this book where people recommend it to me, or like, have you heard about this book? And that makes me even more excited because I feel like a lot of you think that I'm also gonna like it. So I'm sure I will. Another kind of nature-related book that I have is this one, which focuses more on the climate, I guess. It's We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. And I really want to read this. I've had it for a couple of years, and there is a very specific reason why I haven't read it. It's because I read, like, 2-3 years ago, I read the book The Uninhabitable Earth, and that was such a tough read. And it was, like, so hard to take in, and it was terrifying. It was good, but it was terrifying. And although I feel like I learned a lot from that book, it kind of put me off from climate change books. But now I feel like I'm getting over it and I'm ready to dive back in. I don't think most books about climate change are like that book, so yeah, I want to give this a go now. I don't know much about this except that it's about the climate and animal agriculture, and I think about what we eat, which is interesting, and looks like kind of like a quick read. Like the font is quite big and there are a lot of lists. So yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting and educational. On to something a little bit different. We have a true crime book. It's The Falcon Thief by Joshua Hammer. And this is about this guy who stole all of these birds and eggs. And it's about him and the detective who is like determined to stop him. And the reason that I got this book is that it reminds me a little bit of The Feather Thief, which is one of my favorite nonfiction books. Like, it's such a good book. I love it. And this sounds a little bit similar, so I'm hoping that it's gonna scratch that same kind of itch that I have. We basically explore the life of this smuggler in here who spent decades, like, I think capturing or stealing these endangered birds and their eggs. And then we follow this detective who was chasing after him, who worked for the UK, like, wildlife crime unit or something, which sounds like an interesting place to work. And I just think this is it just sounds like a really interesting book to me. There is something about, like, thieves in combination with nature that I think is really interesting. And although I'm not a huge fan of birds in real life, I do find birds in general quite interesting. It's a new thing that I've discovered that I like to read about, so I feel like this is gonna do a lot for me. It sounds a little bit exciting, but also like we're gonna learn quite a lot. Perfect. Then we are going to space with A Brief History of Black Holes, which is obviously a book about space and black holes. And I just think that's really interesting. I've read several books about space. Space is something that I feel like I can never fully grasp, but I really like learning about it. And I find black holes quite interesting, and I feel like I don't know a lot about them. And it says that this is a history of black holes and why nearly everything you know about them is wrong. And I'm wondering how much I'm wrong about. I'm sure probably all of the things that I think. But yeah, I think this is going to be interesting. I love these kinds of bite-sized, easier to read science books. And this also has some pictures and yeah, not much more to say really. I just think it's going to be interesting. I always find these kinds of things interesting. Maybe I'm just a nerd, but yeah, excited. It's also not that long, which is great. Next, we have another memoir. It's Notes on a Silencing by Lacy Crawford. And this is about the author who went to this boarding school. And when she was there, she was assaulted, I'm pretty sure. And then years later, all of these reports start coming out about this school, which rehashes everything for her. And I think she's like ready to dive into it and explore it a little bit. And she takes a look at the school and like how all of these things that were happening at that school were silenced before all of this stuff came out. It sounds kind of harrowing, and because it's a little bit of a longer book, I'm assuming it's really gonna delve into this. And I feel like this is like a hard topic to read about, but it is also interesting. And I feel like there's always something to learn from these kinds of books. Then we have a book about death, which I got quite recently. It's The In-Between, which is kind of like, again, it's the kind of book where we explore the author's life, but there's also more stuff going on. And we also explore the author's like experience with working with end-of-life care. The author, I think we learn a little bit about her early life. She grew up in this religiously strict family, and she broke out of her religion when she was 19 because she had a baby, and she found her purpose in nursing and palliative care, which is very interesting. End-of-life care and death and all of these things, I just really like reading about it. And I've said this before, but it comes from a great fear of death. There's so much about it that we don't really talk about in our culture. There's so much that we don't know, and that really freaks me out. And I'm just like, in general, very scared of death and dying and everything to do with that. And having read more books about it has really helped me. And the more I read, the better I feel. So I think this is going to be very interesting to read, and another it's another one of my death books. I can never get enough of these. Second to last, we have a book that I've had on various TBRs for years now. I feel it's Factfulness by Rosling. And this book basically spends the entire time debunking all of these misconceptions that a lot of us have. Like, there are a lot of facts that we as people just systematically get wrong. And it sort of focuses on how a lot of these things are actually much better than we think they are. I think this sounds really interesting, but also important, because I think that it's kind of about how we have these ideas about certain problems and how they're bigger problems that we think they are, and we don't really need to focus on them as much anymore. Like, maybe we should focus resources and stuff elsewhere. I don't really know, but it sounds interesting. And again, I wonder how much of this I'm gonna be wrong about. I'm sure a lot of the things that I think are wrong. This also has like graphs and stuff, which is very interesting. I feel like I'm gonna learn so much from this book. Lastly, we have Agent Zig Zag by Ben Macintyre. And I want to read this mostly because I've read several books by Ben Macintyre now, and I really, really like all of them. But my favorite one is The Spy and the Traitor. Like, that book is so good. And once I read that book, I just sort of ended up getting a lot of his other books, and now I have several of them on my TBR, and I really need to read them. This one, though, is a biography about this guy who was a spy and like a double agent during the Second World War, and he's like an interesting dude because he's kind of like sketchy, and he's basically a con man, but he also ends up being a hero, which just sounds like a very interesting guy. I also really like a lot of Ben Macintyre's books are about spies, and I've found them to be really, really interesting and surprisingly exciting. So I'm excited to read another one about a spy, I guess. And I really like how he writes these books, because I feel like there's a good balance between you learning a lot of stuff, but also like there's a lot of exciting stuff in his books. So very excited about that. Alright, those were all the books that I had to show you. Wish me luck in trying to get to as many of these books as possible. Whenever I talk about them and I do like TBRs and stuff, I always get really excited, but then I put them back on my shelves and I sometimes forget a little bit. But I'm gonna try with these, maybe I'll start one today actually. I would love to know though, if any of you have any recommendations for a specific type of book. It's memoirs, like the ones that I mentioned, where it's like a memoir, but there's also something else going on. And I don't really necessarily want recommendations for like celebrity memoirs, but if you know of a good memoir that you really, really liked and you think I would love to hear about it, because I would like to get some more, but I'm struggling to find them a little bit. I'd also love to know if you have any nonfiction books on your TBR for 2024. And as always, thank you for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!